This video is sponsored by my amazing website, CrochetGold.store. I have some great products crafted with care. Thank you for your continued support. So Benny Lopez is a complex character, and starting from what we know from her childhood, most of it comes out from season 6, episode 4, where we find out obviously from the type of person that she is. We are getting these clues throughout the seasons, but we find out that she had a negative upbringing and that her mother and father did abuse her verbally, and they did, talk about smacking her around as well, mind you, in the face. And even in that episode, I wondered about her, because we also know by this time that she had a brother, and obviously the abuse was so bad that she killed him off in her mind and ran away, really never spoke to them again. And I refuse to believe, obviously, just knowing the dynamics of growing up as a young girl when you have siblings, especially a brother, and just being in a male-centered patriarchal society. What we can know about that is that I'm sure she saw the favoritism of her being put upon, and having to wash dishes and do all of these things, and that not being something that her male counterparts and her brothers and things like had to do. And they explored this later on in the Lopez versus Lopez show. It wasn't until then they actually explored that, but they did bring up that dynamic, which I'll talk about just a little bit later. But these things definitely messed with her confidence and her self-esteem, and I do believe that is what caused her to go into drinking at such an early age. Like, she turned to that. Obviously, that was one of her coping mechanisms, along with what we can see what made George, and got the major backlash from her parents, which was her having a relationship with Manny, and obviously a sexual relationship that got her pregnant. Right, and this is why she, ended up getting pregnant along with her high school sweetheart, and then she had to drop out, and then she had to start working for a lifelong dead-end job. Now, mind you, there's nothing fully wrong with working a factory job, but we do realize that many people use their jobs in order to not fully meet their potential, or not have to face what their potential is. And especially in Benny's case, because she never actually aspired for anything higher, and used higher aspirations as a weapon against George, because she would tell him things like she would get in his mind and try to tell him things when he would try to reach for anything higher that he would want to do, at possibly, going pro in baseball. She would say things to affect his confidence, like her parents did to her, and it was ultimately the reason why she didn't have a good relationship with them. So why she wouldn't just break the generational curse right there, I don't know. But this is a common thing that people just perpetuate the same circumstances that they were put upon them in the first place, right? So obviously she did also that when she saw he wanted to be a professional musician, and even went so far to tell him that they didn't have the money for college, which, mind you, they threw that out. They didn't make that a whole episode, but they just threw that out for laughs when she said that in an episode. And he had actually broke the generational curse of being one of the first who graduated from high school, even though she didn't believe that he could because of his dyslexia, which she repeatedly made fun of him for, didn't actually get him extra help for, which was a common thing where he almost didn't do the same for Max, because Max actually had that disability as well. And he really did need that help, obviously George and Max, because George was struggling with it at such an early age, and he still struggled with it, so much so he dropped out of college when he was trying to make this good decision for Max, and try to show him that he could go to college and he could aim higher for things, where Max was already feeling that effects of his confidence being weighed down, not just by his family, because his mom and his dad really did support him in a lot of ways, but Benny is still around, and yes, she's still saying those things, like telling him he could work at, the fry counter and stuff like that. So eventually, obviously, when he later on wants to work at the factory, George is the one who also steps in and tries to tell him to reach and aim for higher. And I think that was a way with George reckoning with the fact that he, with the right support, would have been someone who could have gone off to college and just even with his disability, was able to make something more of himself, because it wasn't until like at the beginning of the series that he actually got the manager job. If not for that, then he would have been just on the line working like Benny. But he did have the ability to be a leader, and we did see that throughout the series. So, and also I do believe that her distrust of men, and also her seeking approval from them, because obviously all these mixed feelings are what caused her to treat George really bad. So instead of like giving the negative feelings to her partners, which is hard to give them the negative feelings if they leave and run out on you like Minnie did. So instead of putting that emotional weight on them, she put it on George. And it was even from the time that he was very young, before Minnie ran out on them. We found her in the flashback. We saw her like teaching George words, and the words were like cigarette and cheater, right? Which was like, why are you making that your child's first words? But this is how we're introduced to her raising George back in the day. And obviously they were spending the whole day, and she was spending the whole day telling George things about his father that really wasn't appropriate for him to be learning, which is a thing that she constantly did, because she would be talking about sexual things or the negative sides of relationships with George from a very young age, using him as like an emotional support child. And this also caused negative reactions in George, obviously, because when someone is telling you the negative side of everything without also installing the true values of that same thing, the true values of a relationship at the exact same time, and you're developing, it will obviously warp the way that you think into your adulthood. And we can see those effects not in George Lopez, the actual show. You can see those effects of taking a toll on George in the Lopez versus Lopez show, because I feel like that's the continuation of where the George Lopez show would have went, if not for the fact that basically the show got canceled whenever they did that back in the day. This show is like the continuation of that, and shows where all of that going out, wanting to be emotionally there for your family, but still having, and that obviously in George Lopez show, his mother was there, and then in the Lopez versus Lopez show she was not. And then in the George Lopez show, she was named Benny, which is after his grandma, because that's the woman who really raised him. And then in the Lopez versus Lopez show, that is more of a true to life version, where he was raised by his grandma, who is at the time passed on. And then his actual mother had ran out on him because she had a bipolar disorder disease. So that's the things that we see, taking a toll, a long-term toll on his relationships, is like him not being emotionally available enough with his wife, so it causes them to get a divorce. Him not being truly there for his daughter, which we saw all throughout the show, with George Lopez and Carmen. And they would have little things where he would like try to make up, and at the end of if it's a episode focused on Carmen, that is, they would have it focused on her. And then even the time when she ran away, they would have it like centering her, and then his behavior would really go back after those episodes. So he would really fall back into the same patterns and the routines. So and like I said, I think that really shows his complex relationship with women because of his mom. So now on the show, George Lopez, Benita is the mother, like I said, and that's in real life the grandma's name. And then the more accurate view comes when it's in Lopez versus Lopez. And like I mentioned in the show, she does have that disorder, which now obviously is this condition that is exacerbated by her using substances in a way to self-medicate, which was more indicative of the times that she grew up in, because, you know, back then there was always such a large stigma surrounding mental health, and, you know, just so much so that even when she came back at the ending of Lopez versus Lopez, the season 3, George didn't even believe that she had an actual condition. He just assumed that she was a bad person. And I had to say, like, even before she came on screen and the whole character arc showed us how she was, and, you know, when he was just describing her, when he told the story about her feeding him, and she was saying, you should eat, you look so skinny, you need to eat. And then when he was eating, she would come up to him and yell at him and saying, why are you eating so much? Do you want diabetes? And, like, you know, doing all of that. Even hearing that story on the surface, any healthy person would think that this person has a problem. Now, obviously, with George, he was a child when this was happening, and he grew up, like, obviously happening when he was a child. His mind wasn't fully formed, so when he grew up, he just thought that she was a bad person. His mind had already formed that opinion, so he wasn't obviously going back and, you know, reshaping and looking at it from a different perspective as an adult. So for George, it was always a problem trying to, you know, sort out so much so that he, you know, the very thing that he hated about his parents, he ended up becoming to his own daughter. Speaking first about Carmen on the George Lopez show, I always felt that obviously George showed a clear favoritism, and that's also what I talked about with, you know, Benny. Obviously, one thing that kind of sticks out to you like a very sore thumb is that Benny gave up one of her children, and the child she gave up was the daughter. Now, that could be for many reasons, and in the show they kind of play it like, you know, well, she had already had George, and then she just had that daughter, and then she tried to give George, but then the people returned him, and all of that is actually very weird, and it does play on his confidence, even just knowing that he couldn't have been adopted out and, you know, had a better life. But even when Benny finds out about it, and he finds out about it and gets told about it and all of those things, you know, I always could see like a very weird behavior from the last time that we saw Linda, her name is. The last time that we saw her is in that episode where everybody finds out that Vic and Benny kissed, and then he went out with Linda and kissed her too. Like, yeah, he has his own set of problems. But you know, just looking at that dynamic, that's actually the last time that we see her. And even in the beginning, she didn't want to build a relationship up with her, which could be, you know, towards that male-centeredness and the reason why she did not want to build a relationship with her. But also she just couldn't face the fact that she made such mistakes. And not just saying that adoption is in itself a mistake, because you have to do what's best obviously for the child, but there's a lot more tied into that I really didn't, you know, plan on digging into. I really want to get into, you know, mostly George and how he passed that trauma on to Carmen and Mayan subsequently in the Lopez versus Lopez show. So when there was a dynamic, because in the Lopez show there wasn't the second one, there is no other son to deal with, but in the George Lopez show, he would always show that clear favoritism, and he would say things like it's easier to deal with him, or telling Angie, I'll take the boy and you take the girl, which is just clear abandonment, because his daughter is obviously looking for the emotional connection to her father, and if she doesn't get it from her father, she's gonna seek it in other guys, which we clearly see her do. She has like this very clingy attachment style, and it's because her father is so heavy on, you know, pushing her away or just leaving all of her emotional stuff for her mom, you know, her emotional side, leaving it for her mom to deal with, and he'll be half a parent half of the time. So obviously she has this very toxic relationship with young men, and we can see that, and that's exactly what I imagined Benny to be like when she was feeling, abandoned by her father, and not even having the comfort of having an Angie type mother figure around. And I do feel like that's a part of the reason why she was jealous and mad at Angie a lot of the times. It wasn't just that, oh, you guys are too soft on the kids and blah blah blah. Meanwhile, she would have enjoyed a childhood like these kids were having, not being smacked around, not being told that you're less than, and not being forced to do most of the household work, which she hated, because she was always called Angie, a princess and blah blah blah. A princess isn't cleaning up the house and cooking all the meals and doing all of that. Angie is doing also a real emotional labor and work like that. She's making it seem like, oh well, you have to get a job now. Like everything she's been doing at this point has been a job as well, including supporting her husband. And actually, I do believe that she was a part of the reason that made him more confident, not just by having her as a wife, but having her in his ear telling him he could reach higher for things like that, where his mother never did things like that and played on his confidence all the time. So yes, it was definitely clear that Carmen was acting out in order to get a reaction out of George, and she wanted that reaction to be one of caring and showing that he really loved her. Now, this does show a lot about Carmen's character when it comes to guys. Like I said, she would date and she would be searching in their pool, right, in the way, and she would be searching for and just caring and investing a lot in a guy. Like even when Jason's parents like scooted and left out of town, and she was over there and caring for him, washing his clothes, making him dinner and all of that. She really wanted that investment because she never got that from her father. So she instead poured a lot of that into her relationships, and it really caused her, until she went off of college, and we really don't know what happened then, but it caused her to over invest in these relationships where she should have been more investing in herself. And like I said, this all stems from Benny, because George was always in search of her approval. Now Benny from the George Lopez show version was not displayed as incapable of meeting her child's needs, because she did do it in moments where she was with Max and things like that. It was just played off like she, in my opinion, did not want to. And this is not to forget the fact that she had to heal her trauma, but you could clearly see that she knew that there was a better way of being, but she refused to concede, because in her mind she thought that would let George win, and it was a constant power play between those two. She did not want George to do better or be a better parent than she had, because obviously it would have shown that you can actually work through your trauma and not let your trauma hold you back from being the best version of a parent that your child actually deserves, because they don't know the trauma that you have had, and if you acknowledge that the childhood trauma that you experienced was wrong, which she did when her mother came to testify at her trial. She talked about how her parents shouldn't have smacked her around like that. And it is very hypocritical, because even in the later years, not just from what we know of George's childhood, but even as a grown man, she would smack him on the head, and it was very clear that it took a toll on his confidence as a man and as a parent. So much so, like when he took her back in after she burned her damn house down, when he took her in, she would treat him so badly and put his mistakes on the refrigerator like she did when he was a kid, and smack him upside his head. He just couldn't take it. He had to move out of his own house. Like, he's doing you a favor and you still are spitting in his face, right? So much so, like I said, that whole thing, he went and stayed with Ernie and his family before he could ever even continue to live with her again. And just the way that she was purposefully antagonizing him, even though he was doing her such a huge favor. So not only did Billy not want to work through her triggers, but it actually triggered her more when she saw Angie and George's relationship. So Angie is someone who grew up in a more emotionally regulated house, and you can say what you will about her parents individually, but as parents, they seemingly did a great job with positive reinforcement and their children. And you could also see this throughout the series that Benny was very jealous of Angie because of a lot of the bad behaviors that could tear their marriage apart. Benny actually encouraged, and Benny had a direct hand And because, no man ever fully treated Benny the way that she would have liked until the very end of the season. So she could not stand George, like, treating Angie like a queen. She could not stand that. She would say things that he was like whipped, and when he was treating her like a great partner, and she would antagonize him in order to get him to act out on these bad behaviors. And a great example of what I'm talking about is when it's Angie's birthday and George finally remembers, and Benny walks in when he's wrapping her present. So he's doing this and he's getting ready for her to come downstairs, and she plays on his confidence and tells him, well, why are you wrapping her present and getting ready to give it to her today, because her birthday isn't until this weekend or whatever. And then he starts to doubt himself, and when he does, she takes advantage of that and takes his present outside when he gives it to her, and then like tells her to hide it. And then she walks back in with the present and gives it to Angie. Now, I feel like Angie obviously should have known that Benny wasn't getting your ass no present, definitely not no cashmere sweater. And, George could have done the Uno reverse on her and, said, I know what's in that present. It's a cashmere sweater because I bought it for you, and described it and all of that, where Benny couldn't do that because he had already wrapped the present. Like I said, I felt Angie should have known that this wasn't from Benny, because he obviously, like the last time she gave you a present, it was a swan from a restaurant that y'all had just eaten at, and it was not even her leftovers. It was the leftovers that a lady left in the bathroom. You thought that lady would go from giving you that to giving you a cashmere sweater? Be so fucking for real. But obviously I can see why she didn't see that in the, in that moment, because what type of monstrous behavior would actually do that to, especially to your own son? And if I was George in this situation, like I said, I would have described that that present right there on the spot. And obviously this is in season 5, episode 9, where he, pays her back, in case you want to go watch that. But yes, he pays her back by, embarrassing her at the factory when it was her work anniversary party. And this dynamic just showed that, first of all, she couldn't stand to see George treat Angie right, because like I said, he remembered birthdays, and she didn't like when there was negative attention being showed to her, even when it was done rightly so. Now, I'm not necessarily talking about the party, but I am talking about just the fact that him bringing up the reasons why he misses the importance of birthdays and anniversaries is because she never celebrated any of his birthdays or his anniversaries or anything that was a big deal to him as a child, like making a sports team, and having games and going to them and things of that nature. Obviously, we could say, well, she was a single parent, so she couldn't have gone to every game, but even, one game that she promised to go to later on, when she's dating Jerry Springer, we'll see her, flake out on that. And it's not like she just couldn't go to the game. She couldn't go to the game and go to Jerry Springer's dinner with his boss or whatever. So she decided to put that importance of that man over her child. So obviously he's been, brought up with these things as not being such a serious thing, whereas Angie, obviously her parents, celebrated their children in their own ways. So obviously they have an importance to, like, as anybody would, to their own birthdays and things like that. But she, never took these things seriously. And even in one episode, Benny went so far as to say that in their culture, like, a thing that she regularly did was like to smear pee on George's face because of the evil eye. And everybody was telling George that he was like such a pretty baby and all of this, that the way that she countered that was to smear pee on his face because the evil eye. And she thought that, if things are good that are happening to you, then something bad is going to happen to you. So you have to constantly be doing bad things in order to, in order for, I guess, the, good things in your life to like stay around, maybe just in small doses, because you're constantly, doing negative things to yourself so that the good doesn't outweigh the bad, and then something really bad happens to you. Obviously, I can't fully verbalize what in the hell this type of thinking is, because it is ass backwards to the T. And it really, says to me like religious psychosis, not just like the evil eye, in itself, but just like the thinking and the like I said, the psychosis of it all, the making these mental pictures real in your mind above all else, and above even how you feel or how even your child is feeling in the moment, because I'm sure he wasn't having a good time having piss smeared on his face, so things of that nature, just because you don't want to celebrate because you're afraid that they may be taken away from you. So because he saw the effects in the long term, though, obviously he should have done better. Like George, that wasn't his excuse. I don't give him an excuse out, because he saw the long-term effects of how he felt when his mom didn't celebrate him, and all of these things. He knew what it was like to not be celebrated, and to be tossed to the side, and to feel that you weren't important. And as compared to like any other relationship that your mom had, he went so far as to even sabotage one of her relationships because of that. So he definitely knew, and he should have done better for his wife and for his family. And especially when as an adult you're getting everything that you wanted as a child, which is a family that is loving you unconditionally, a wife that is very helpful and supportive as a partner through your ups and downs, and still you didn't take the initiative to say, I'm going to make this a priority in my life and in my family life, because this really affected me as a child. Not having my mom do what was right by me. And you can see the major toll that it took on George. Like I said, in episode 11 season 6, you can see how George lied in order to get the boyfriend out, who, like I said, was played by Jerry Springer, out of Benny's life, because at this time George was clearly, like he had been his whole life, more starved for attention. Even though he was currently, an only child, because the other child wasn't there, he was starved because his mom still took all of the attention and had multiple partners. And George knew about that. They called them his special uncles, right? So, he knew that he had to, he thought as a child, this is his only way of really, his only mechanism of having that power was, to manipulate Benny by hitting on what he knew was a sore point for her, was being cheated on. And because she had been, basically since he was in the high chair, she has been belly aching to him about her relationships and, being cheated on. So using that sore point, that she has with men, he knew exactly what to do in order to get him out of their lives, even though obviously it was a better, fit for Benny, and it was a guy who was actually, settling down and would have treated her right and did all these things later on in life. If he would have did that at the time, I don't know, because he still did get married a couple of times, so he still had some things to work out before. But he could have messed it up with Benny, but we wouldn't know, because George basically framed him for being a cheater. But he knew exactly what to do in order to get him out of their lives, because the way his child brain was looking at it was that he's already not getting enough attention from her, and he just couldn't handle the impact of her not showing up to his games even more, and not taking seriously what he is taking seriously, because she was going to not show up for the game, even though she said she would do that. And it was a very big deal to him. And her even talking about being a single mother and all of that couldn't be the cop out. Like I said before, neither could be the fact that she had to work jobs, because she made time to go. She was going to make time to go out to that dinner. So you can say all that you want, or you could say that you were busy and all of this, or you were a single mother who couldn't do this and that, or couldn't find the time to go to your only son's baseball game. But you could definitely find that time for any male to give them any attention. So that was Benny's cross to bear as well. But the next thing I want to talk about is her coping mechanisms, and if we're being quite frank, addictions to cigarettes and drinking, and also I would say a sex addiction thrown in there as well, which was also in that episode, the one I listed above, of her making fun of the her being made of at the anniversary party that she had at work. He touched on all of those sore points for her, basically her being a drunk, and being loose or whatever, I guess, and all of that. And I want to tie into how that affected George in the Lopez versus Lopez show as well. So Benny, throughout the series, from the very beginning, you can see her smoking cigarettes and drinking beers and more, and this is obviously used as her coping mechanisms, because she got introduced to these things very early, but she used them later on in life as a crutch. And even when smoking had basically took away so much from her, by not even just the health, but it took away the home that she lived in for so many years, and she still did not take that as serious as she could have, because she, left a cigarette lit, and it took her home away. And this was, later on, it even took her job from her, because she, like, when faced with the consequence of like smoking and being addicted to that, instead of keeping her job and deciding to quitting smoking, she decided to quit her job and to keep smoking, which was odd. And also they try to frame it as, oh, she did this for George, because George also had terrible coping mechanisms, because since she couldn't smoke, basically she was treating him terribly. And he used that in order, or basically she always treated him terribly, but he used in order to not speak up for himself and advocate for himself, which is, I don't know what type of quack told him that the problem with him, the problem with her smoking was the fact that he complained. It was like, she's treating him badly. His only way to advocate for himself is to speak up, and then instead of being told that he can do that, it's like, well, you're stressing your mom out, and that's the reason why she smokes. It's like, no, she was smoking before she even met George, so what was the reason for that? Like, what type of quack doctor they went to? I can't take that seriously. But obviously, like I said, he started eating and binge eating because he was having to cope so much, and he couldn't say anything about it because he didn't want to bring a lot of harm to her. So he just took it, and then she decided to just leave the job. But like I mentioned, she even was smoking so much throughout the series. You really see the effects of it, let's say, in episode 1, season 5. Before this even happened, though, like when she burned her house down in that season 5, then when their garage burned down, he immediately turned to Benny, because he thought that it was her who burned down the garage. And he was like, how many times do I have to tell you that this, meaning flicking a cigarette, because you can't see the action that I'm doing, but flicking away the cigarette is not putting a cigarette out. So it's very clear of her negligence, and how that could have caused serious issues from before, and obviously why he thought it was her who did that anyway. And obviously George knew it was detrimental because he had seen the effects his whole life. Now, in the Lopez versus Lopez show, he actually has a drinking problem, one that of course he got from his parents. And because this is all generational trauma being passed down, and of course George Lopez show, you can see him having beers and going to bars and drinking worms and doing all of the things that the show was showing it off in more of a lighthearted way. They never actually touched on how this was actually his destructive behavior and very destructive for him. But on the second show, though, you could really see how they went there, and they showed that him drinking over such a long ass time did so much damage to him, not in just his physical health, but it also played a very large part in one of the reasons why his relationships broke up. He would go out to the bars with one of his friends that was already divorced, and this friend was encouraging him in this bad behavior of getting drunk and talking to other women, because he had already lost his woman. So of course he was encouraging the worst to come out of George in order to not feel like he was alone. And obviously with his daughter seeing that sort of behavior, it messed with their relationship, because if you're out drinking with your friends instead of being at home and raising her, she can obviously tell there's a difference in your parenting, a difference in the styles and the skills that you're showing. So in the second show, I like that they took the time to show him going to a rehabilitation, the meetings, and getting the chips, and even like struggling to falling off the wagon, not just trying to play up the drinking and run around for laughs, but they really try to show him growing up and really maturing and actually trying to break those generational curses, because that was something that was clearly passed down from his mother. Even if he didn't acknowledge it, even if he never met her, we still take on these things because it's like programming in our DNA, right? We have these things. Even if we never meet that parent that abandoned us or whatever, we can still take on their traits because they're our most close relative, right? So like I say, even if he didn't acknowledge it, even though he didn't have a great relationship with his mom, it was still something that he couldn't shake. And throughout the times where he was even lightly compared to her, he couldn't stand that, because he thought of himself as better than her, because he couldn't see himself accurately, and he couldn't see that he was in his own way being the exact same way as her. Of course, he will try to frame it as different, as not as extreme, but it's still the same behaviors. And he really couldn't fully see it until his daughter grew up and really started telling him all of these things. And it was because of Mayim that she was a stable adult who was raised by her mother, and she didn't let her traumas sink her ship. So, of course, Rosie was like the Angie archetype, as well as a Cuban in the show who was raised in a more stable home life, let's say. So, George leaving her really didn't mess her life up in any significant way. And of course, she was going to have the difficulties. We do see her struggle with depression. I mean, of course, postpartum and things of that nature. But when I say a significant way, I just mean she didn't have to deal much with homelessness and not being able to provide for her daughter. She was still a stable adult who was able to provide for her and still had a successful career. Where even George, he had drank so much, basically his business was failing. And, she still was able to do her thing regardless of George's abandonment of the family. So watching these two show, I definitely feel like it was a masterclass in the, passing down of generational trauma and how you can heal all of these things, and honesty, and, how you can't heal what you don't reveal. Because, if Mayan didn't take up that torch and change her ways and, really take up after her mom in a lot of ways, she could have gone down the same path and been exactly like the new generation of a Benny, which is someone who was definitely adultified at a young age, let's say, because she was growing up in situations at a very age. But instead of that kicking her into a second gear when she got pregnant with George, instead of her taking that situation more seriously and using that opportunity to basically right the wrongs of her parents, she used ways to cope that she probably saw her parents using, her father, whatever. Maybe he was just the type of guy who had a beer after he came home from work, and she just picked up that trait and thought, this is what just adults do, or whatever, and obviously she used that to cope because she was not able to fully live out her childhood and teenhood in ways that she would have liked. And of course, she used these things that broke her in order to continue to cope with just her life not being the way that she would have liked. And it's like having a bunch of loose relationships with men that meant nothing, and drinking and smoking and all of that. And in my analyst brain, it really just goes to show that the thing that broke you could never ever really be the thing that heal you. And I do feel for Benny, and I do feel that she, if she would have dealt with her childhood in a more mature way, because obviously when you have a child, that's one of the most mature things that you could ever do. Even though it happened quicker than she would have liked, she would have made a much more stable single parent for George, and then possibly George would have been a better parent for Mayan / Carmen, and yes, it is unfortunate that as the more marginalized people in society, we can feel like we don't get to have a childhood. Even how Mayan grew up, and she was an only child, but she could clearly see, from the abandonment of her dad, that was a problem. And she could also see the motherhood flaws that her mom actually had, and her being a male-centered parent. Even though she only had a daughter, she could see it when her cousins came around and different aspects like that. So there's different ways and different levels of trauma that could happen when you don't fully get to live out the childhood version of yourself, or when you do, but you can analyze it, and when you grow up as an adult. Because the adults who were, if the adults who were parenting you haven't fully learned the things that they need, to, and they grew up looking at these things, and although it was normalized, it was not normal. But if your parents don't come to that realization, then what's abnormal will be made normal for you until you grow up and hopefully realize that this isn't the way that you should be living your life. And this certainly isn't the way that you would want to raise your children. And I feel like Lopez versus Lopez, the show, was doing a better job of bringing the seriousness to these issues while still having a comedic show. They can have those light moments and all of that, because obviously some of our favorite sayings are, you have to laugh to keep from crying. So no one is going to be super serious or sad or negative every day, because that wouldn't help all of these situations. But if there isn't serious moments in order to deal with what's actually happening like all around you, then you can never actually alchemize the lessons that you need to be learning from when serious things are taking place around you all the time. These are very serious situations like abandonment, addiction, all of these things. But as a child, if you don't recognize that, obviously, because it's hard for you to really place what's happening, you just think that this is the way that people behave, and then you grow up and you don't learn these lessons yourself. It does, really play a toll on you. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Definitely one of the longer ones that I've done, and I do want to do more breakdowns of characters and things like this. I just did a whole rewatch of the George Lopez show, and then I went into watching Lopez versus Lopez just because it just came out and then it went away, unfortunately, because I think it was a great extension of the show. That's why I had to mix these two together. And I feel like this was even a breakdown of George Lopez too, if I'm being honest. But Angie, I do like that Carmen, Mayan similarities and how these things get fostered. I do think I have some more thoughts about that. But yeah, let me know what you think, and I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time. Peace. Oh yeah, until next time, keep creating.